In 1950, the fastest fighter the United States Air Force had in service could barely crack 600 miles per hour. That was the ceiling. The technology, the materials, the engines, none of it existed yet to go much further than that. And then, in roughly 15 years, American engineers built machines that could travel faster than a rifle bullet, faster than sound travels in water, faster than almost anything that had ever moved through the Earth's atmosphere. What pushed them there wasn't one thing. It was the Cold War pressing on one side and American engineering pride pressing back on the other. Every aircraft on today's list is a verified production or operational aircraft, with speed records confirmed by the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, or the National Aeronautics Association. No prototypes that never left the program, no classified numbers that can't be sourced. 8. North American F-86 Sabre. On September 15, 1948, the XP-86 prototype broke the sound barrier in a shallow dive, something North American initially kept quiet because the aircraft wasn't officially rated for it. The production F-86A that followed didn't break the sound barrier in level flight, but it got closer than anything the Air Force had put into service before it, and it did it in a war. Over the Yalu River in Korea, F-86 pilots squared off against Soviet-built MiG-15s in the world's first large-scale jet-versus-jet combat. The MiG could outclimb the Sabre and had a higher service ceiling. What the Sabre had was a hydraulic flight control system and a gun sight that could actually track a moving target, and pilots who knew how to use both. The kill ratio came out somewhere between 7-1 and 10-1 in favor of the Sabre, depending on which historian you're asking. The F-86D variant, fitted with an afterburner and an all-weather radar nose, set an official world speed record of 715.7 miles per hour on July 16, 1953, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel William Barnes. That was enough to make it the fastest aircraft in the world at the time of the record. Not a title it would hold for long, but a title it earned legitimately. North American built 9,860 Sabres before production ended. Variants flew for air forces on 6 continents. The basic aerodynamic formula, swept wing, single turbojet, narrow fuselage, became the template that every subsonic fighter that followed would start from. You can see the Sabre silhouette in almost every single-engine jet fighter built in the decade after it. 7. Vought F-8U Crusader. The United States Navy had a problem in the mid-1950s. Its carrier-based fighters couldn't go supersonic without losing the ability to land back on the ship at a reasonable speed. Go fast enough to fight MiGs, and you'd need a runway 3 times longer than any carrier deck could offer. Vaught's solution was a variable incidence wing, a wing that could pivot upward by 7 degrees on takeoff and landing, giving the fuselage a flat attitude while the wing bit into the air at a high angle. The pilot could see where he was going, the aircraft could fly slowly enough to catch the arresting wire, and the same machine that puttered down to the deck at 125 miles per hour could accelerate to Mach 1.53 once the wing rotated back down and the throttle went forward. On August 21, 1956, Major John Glenn, that John Glenn, flew an F-8U-1P photo reconnaissance Crusader from Los Angeles to New York in 3 hours, 23 minutes, and 8.4 seconds, averaging 725 miles per hour coast to coast. The flight was called Project Bullet and made front pages across the country, though Glenn at the time was simply a Marine test pilot doing his job. The Crusader flew in combat over Vietnam and was the last American fighter with guns as its primary weapon rather than missiles. French Navy Crusaders were still flying operational missions in the 1990s. The variable incidence wing was never copied. It was too mechanically complex. But the problem it solved, slow-speed carrier compatibility with supersonic cruise, became the central design challenge for every carrier aircraft that came after it. 6. McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. The Voodoo started its life as an escort fighter, meant to accompany Strategic Air Command bombers deep into Soviet airspace and fight off whatever came up to intercept them. By the time it was ready to fly, SAC had decided it didn't need escorts anymore. The bombers would fly so high and fast that fighters couldn't catch them anyway. So the Air Force looked at what they had and asked what else it could do. What they had was the biggest, heaviest single-seat fighter the Air Force had ever put into production. The RF-101 reconnaissance version went supersonic on the deck, down where the air is thick and drag is maximum, without breaking a sweat. On December 12, 1957, an RF-101 set a transcontinental speed record, Los Angeles to New York, in 3 hours and 7 minutes, cutting nearly 20 minutes off John Glenn's run from the year before. Then a second Voodoo flew back the other direction the same day. Operation Sun Run, they called it. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, unarmed RF-101s flew low-level photo missions over Soviet missile sites in Cuba, coming back with the photographs that proved to the world the missiles were real. Flying below radar coverage, fast enough the Cuban anti-aircraft fire consistently missed, the Voodoo was the reason the Kennedy administration had pictures to show at the United Nations. The aircraft was loud, demanding to fly, and unforgiving of mistakes at low speed. Pilots who mastered it loved it. 807 were built. The reconnaissance variant stayed in service until 1979.
5. Convair F-106 Delta Dart. The F-106 was sold to the American public as the ultimate interceptor, the final answer to Soviet bombers crossing the polar route with nuclear weapons. It flew nearly alone in that role for almost 20 years, which gives you some sense of how good it was. The airframe was a pure delta, no horizontal tail, a triangular wing that ran almost the full length of the fuselage, an arrangement that Convair had been refining since the early 1959 and had downed cold by the time the Delta Dart flew. The engine was a single Pratt & Whitney J75, producing 24,500 pounds of thrust with afterburner. The weapons were carried internally in a rotary bay, not hung under the wings where they disturbed the airflow, and included the AIR-2A Genie, an unguided rocket with a 1.5 kiloton nuclear warhead designed to detonate inside a formation of enemy bombers. On December 15, 1959, Major Joseph Rogers flew an F-106 to 1,525.95 miles per hour at Edwards Air Force Base, setting an absolute world speed record for a production aircraft that stood for more than a year. The run was clean, level flight, measured by radar, no tricks. What nobody planned for was the F-106 outlasting everything it was supposed to be replaced by. The F-108 Rapier was canceled. The B-58 Hustler it was meant to escort was retired. The F-106 kept flying Air Defense Command missions until 1988, 30 years after it first flew. The last ones were converted into target drones. The very last F-106 drone was shot down in 1997, the end of a lineage that had started before most of the people shooting at it were born. 4. North American A-5 Vigilante. The Vigilante was designed to fly off carriers and deliver nuclear bombs at Mach 2. That mission lasted almost no time at all. What came after it lasted 3 decades and changed the way wars were photographed in a reshaped fuselage pod.
North American's engineers built the Vigilante around a linear bomb bay that ran through the fuselage between the two engines. Nuclear weapons and fuel tanks were loaded onto a rail and ejected rearward out of the tail. On paper, this worked. In practice, the system was mechanically unreliable enough that the nuclear strike mission was canceled within a few years of the aircraft entering service.
And it could carry all of that over enemy territory at twice the speed of sound, low enough to get useful photographs and fast enough that most things sent up to intercept it couldn't catch it. RA-5Cs flew over North Vietnam throughout the war. They were the aircraft sent in after strikes to photograph the damage, which meant flying the same routes the strike packages had just come down, with every gun and missile on the ground already warmed up and pointed at the sky. 17 Vigilantes were lost in Vietnam, a higher loss rate than almost any other aircraft in the conflict. The crews who flew them knew the odds and flew the missions anyway. The Vigilante had fly-by-wire flight control assistance, a head-up display, and an integrated avionics suite that was 20 years ahead of anything else on a carrier deck. It was retired in 1979 when the Navy decided the job could be done more cheaply by a pod hung under an F-14. That decision was probably right on paper. Nobody who flew the Vigilante thought so.
3. Lockheed YF-12.
Most people know the SR-71 Blackbird. Fewer know that before the SR-71 became a reconnaissance aircraft, Lockheed built a version designed to intercept and destroy enemy aircraft at 3 times the speed of sound. That aircraft was the YF-12, and for 4 years it held the absolute world speed record, the fastest any piloted aircraft had ever flown in the Earth's atmosphere, confirmed and certified. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works team built the YF-12 from titanium because aluminum couldn't survive the heat generated by sustained Mach 3 cruise. Aerodynamic friction at that speed pushes surface temperatures above 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The fuel was a specially formulated hydrocarbon, JP7, with a flash point so high it was almost impossible to ignite with a match. The engines required a chemical ignition system using triethylborane, a compound that bursts into flame on contact with air. The aircraft actually expanded in length by nearly a foot at cruise temperature. On May 1, 1965, a YF-12 piloted by Colonel Robert Stevens and Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Andre flew to 2,701.102 miles per hour over Edwards Air Force Base. 8 world records fell that single day. The speed record stood until 1976, when an SR-71, the same basic airframe and reconnaissance configuration, finally eclipsed it. Only 3 YF-12s were ever built. The Interceptor program was canceled in 1968 when the Air Force decided the Soviet bomber threat didn't justify the cost. One of the 3 airframes was destroyed in a landing accident. The surviving 2 are at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, and at the Air Force Flight Test Museum at Edwards. They sit in those museums and people walk past them and look at them and have no idea they're looking at something that once flew faster than anything in the sky.
2. North American X-15. Every aircraft on this list, except one, is something you could call an airplane in the conventional sense, a machine that takes off, flies a mission, and lands. The X-15 was a different kind of machine. It was a manned hypersonic research rocket that happened to have wings, and what it found out about high-speed flight built the foundation for everything that came after it. North American built 3 X-15s under contract with NASA, the Air Force, and the Navy. The aircraft was carried aloft under the wing of a B-52 and dropped at altitude, at which point the pilot lit the XLR-99 rocket engine, a 57,000-pound thrust motor that burned for roughly 80 seconds and accelerated the aircraft to speeds the atmosphere had never seen a manned vehicle reach. On October 3, 1967, William Pete Knight flew X-15-2 to 4,520 miles per hour. The skin temperature during that run exceeded 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit at some points on the leading edges. The aircraft was coated in an ablative material that partially burned away during the flight, which was intentional. It was, in effect, performing a controlled burn of its own surface to manage heat. After landing, the X-15 looked like it had been through something, because it had. 8 of the 12 pilots who flew the X-15 program reached altitudes
qualifying them as astronauts under the Air Force's 50-mile definition, including Neil Armstrong, 2 years before he walked on the moon. The program collected data on hypersonic aerodynamics, pilot physiology, reaction control systems in the upper atmosphere, and heat-resistant materials that directly informed the design of the Space Shuttle's re-entry profile. Every time the shuttle came back through the atmosphere, it was using math that Pete Knight and the other X-15 pilots had lived. 13 people flew the X-15 a combined 199 times between 1959 and 1968. The program ended with the death of Michael Adams, who lost control during re-entry on November 15, 1967, and whose aircraft broke apart over the Mojave Desert. The remaining 2 X-15s are at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington and at the Air Force Museum in Dayton. They are the fastest winged aircraft ever flown by a human being. Nothing since has come close.
1. Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. Before getting into this one, something needs to be said up front. The X-15 at Mach 6.70 is the faster number. It isn't close, and nothing on this list or any other list touches it. What sits at the top today belongs to a completely different category. The X-15 was a rocket dropped from a bomber, flown for 80 seconds of powered flight, recovered with no landing gear worth the name, and never used operationally. The SR-71 was a fully operational aircraft that flew missions, real missions, over real denied territory, bringing back photographs that shaped American foreign policy. And in that category, the fastest operational aircraft ever flown by any nation at any time in the history of aviation, nothing has ever touched it. Nothing built since, nothing flying today. Lockheed's Skunk Works delivered the first SR-71 to the Air Force in 1966. The design came directly from the same team and the same thinking that built the YF-12, with the interceptor hardware stripped out and reconnaissance sensors packed into every available cavity. The aircraft was built to fly reconnaissance missions that no missile could intercept and no fighter could catch. And for the entire operational life of the program, that premise held. Not one SR-71 was ever shot down. More than 1,000 missiles were fired at SR-71s during operational missions. Every one of them missed, because by the time the missile completed its intercept calculation and launched, the SR-71 had already moved outside the engagement envelope. The sustained cruise speed of Mach 3.2 plus meant that the aircraft's skin reached temperatures high enough to glow a dull red at some points during flight. The windscreen was subjected to temperatures that would have melted conventional glass. The titanium skin panels were deliberately manufactured with gaps between them, because at cruise temperature the metal expanded enough to close every gap flush. At rest on the ground, the aircraft leaked fuel from the panel joints and had to be refueled after every takeoff. On July 28, 1976, SR-71 serial number 61-7958 set the official absolute speed record for a jet-powered aircraft, 2,100.
The 1950s and 1960s stand as the only era in aviation history when the speed of operational aircraft increased by a factor of more than 3 in a single decade. The F-86 that flew combat in Korea in 1950 topped out below the speed of sound. The SR-71 that followed it into service 15 years later flew operational missions at Mach 3.2. What happened in between was not gradual. It was engineers and test pilots and the Cold War creating conditions where the answer to "can we go faster?" was always yes, because the alternative was falling behind. Which aircraft from today's list means the most to you? The Crusader and the variable incidence wing that solved a problem nobody else could crack? The Vigilante crews who flew the same routes twice with every gun already pointed at them? Or the Blackbird record from 1976 that nobody has touched in 50 years? Drop a comment and tell me. I read every one. If you learned something today, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.